Hi, everybody. Steve Cady here at Bowling Green State University with our doctorate in organization development and change. We have a variety of people, students from our program to friends from across campus and beyond. A couple things for our doctoral program. In the background here, I was writing on the board one day and I've been working on a couple concepts, but one of the things I think about the focus of our doctorate program, you may not see this exactly, but it's about organizational transformation and performance, community development, and personal growth or developing human potential. And at the intersection of these things is what many of our students in our program are doing. And over here is a kind of a thing that I've been working on around scholars and practitioners, where scholars look at research and teaching, where practitioners look at managing and consulting, and sort of this notion of these four kind of roles that a lot of our students in our program are pursuing, and what we call the career quartet, which is, building out thought leadership enables people to have more opportunities to manage, to consult, to research, and to teach, and giving people the most opportunity to do that where they want, when they want, with whom they want, making the living they want. And so that's the general focus of our program. And we have a variety of people here, like I said, from the program, our partner and IO side. We have people, faculty such as Sam, hi Sam, and others that are joining us. So it's really great to have all of you here. Steve is working with our program and playing a very important role. The role is helping to bring in early on, right out of the gates, coaching through the lens of personal feedback to each student using the Hogan Assessment inventory, and how to use that tool to help our students reflect on and think about their learning journey and how they're going to improve and grow as people in their journey towards thought leadership through the program. So it sets the stage. We have a whole coaching class in the summer of the second year, or really at the end of the first year, and other things that we do to kind of build that out. But this sets and plants the seed for that. And so the cohorts, both cohorts, cohort 1 and cohort 2, have had feedback. We've looked at individually. They all have individual coaching sessions, in addition to giving the whole cohort feedback on its profile kind of collectively. And so this is a follow-up to a lot of feedback around, let's look at the practice and the science of this. And so Steve's been super to work with us. I'm very grateful for you, Steve, and for the work that you do with our group and our students. And I'm looking forward to you sharing with us. So I'd love for you to share a little bit of your story through that lens of scholar practitioner, through that lens of thought leadership, and segue that into your talk, and just go ahead and take us on the journey with you. We'll then go into groups, and then we'll have Q&A from there. So Steve.
Great, thank you, Steve. A very nice introduction, and I think some of this is mirroring or reflective that I'm looking forward to learning a lot from you as well. And every time we have an individual coaching session, I grow a little bit. And in these types of sessions, the back and forth and hearing different perspectives is always, I think, really, really valuable. In terms of the Hogan, I wish I had had something like that back before I was entering grad school and maybe out of undergrad. Now, I'm not sure I would have been ready for the feedback at that point of time. I don't think I would have been able to comprehend it in full and make use of it. But, my path to IO, industrial organizational, was, I think, similar to a lot of industrial organizational folks, where in undergrad, I didn't go in to be a psychologist necessarily, but ended up really loving psychology, teaching a lot of people in my dorm about psychology, and graduated with a dual degree in psychology and English writing. Went on, was pursuing the English writing side of that, and had always wished, by the way, that loved social psychology. Couldn't get enough of that. Actually liked research methods a lot, liked history and systems, but really, really loved social psychology. And I was wishful that there had been a psychology that studied the workplace. And I don't know that I had it in those exact words, but it's like, boy, too bad there's not something that's more applied to the workplace. And I didn't know about IO psychology. And sure enough, as I went through the first few years of my career and in my career development, I was in radio, ended up in radio, market research, then radio, was working midnights in market research, working 5 a.m.s in radio. These aren't all at the same time. But, was down that path in radio and eventually made the choice to go back to graduate school, wanted something a little bit more. I still remember to this day, though, that there was one particular person in radio I was working with, and she was a little bit older than me. And when she found out I had a bachelor's degree, was asking me, what are you doing here? Why are you in radio? I didn't necessarily talk like everybody else. It was, a little bit different there. So ended up applying to graduate school. A little bit of a tidbit for you. I shared this a few years ago. I had presented to the BGSU Industrial Organizational Psychology program on a topic. And one of the things I shared was I actually got rejected by Bowling Green's IO psychology program. And an interesting note on that, and Sam might be the only one to appreciate this, but Scott Highhouse spoke up at that moment. He too, and Scott Highhouse is this very accomplished figure in our field. Apparently he also got rejected by Bowling Green's IO psychology program. But I was accepted at Wayne State and pursued my doctorate at Wayne State. As I was getting started, I was learning more about what it means to be an academic in general. Didn't really have a good feel for what that was. That was another reason why I didn't immediately go back to graduate school. I really didn't know what I was getting into when I went to graduate school. I was in a bowling league. I had a couple jobs I was holding down, and I'd started courses. And I learned real quick that wasn't going to work out for the type of doctorate program that I was pursuing there. So major life changes during that time, and was pursuing the field. Started to learn that a couple of the career options were going into academics or going applied, and that was often the way it was phrased, academics or applied. And so it's interesting that Steve mentions the scholar practitioner model, because we talk a lot about that in IO psychology too, but then you get this sort of counter question. The Q isn't there for it, right? That are you going to go academic or are you going to go applied? So honestly, Steve kind of knows how to get my ear a little bit when he talks about that scholar practitioner model and being able to do multiple things as a thought leader. And so as I was going forward, really enjoyed research on executive succession and what, looking at team presidents and looking at CEOs and what makes them successful. And there was an open question pretty late into my IO career in grad school of which way I would go. Now, that said, the field had become much more competitive for academic positions. So it's not like I made the choice fully that at the end that I'll pick this one. I hadn't really prepared myself fully to go academic. And during my time in grad school, I obtained an opportunity with a management consulting firm called A.T. Kearney, which was really focused on strategic sourcing. But I ended up on a project at one of the largest organizations in the world on culture change, and was on it for several years during graduate school and just loved it. Just loved that management consulting field, working with really, really bright people and being in the mix of trying to move these organizations forward. And so that sort of helped me make that decision to go applied. And afterwards, for some family reasons, I was staying in the Detroit area, and we ended up, so I ended up at Blue Cross Blue Shield of Michigan, was there for about a dozen years, doing a lot of culture change, a little bit on the selection side. I've done some selection, but mostly I'm a culture change, organizational development practitioner by my career credentials, I guess is the way to put it, and have always maintained an interest in publishing and academic pieces. Was lucky enough to take my dissertation and work with a friend of mine who was a colleague, and along with a team that he was able to build up. He's a professor. We published in the Journal of Applied Psychology. That was a success there. Honestly, for me, I wanted to get some of that in the practitioner journals too. So there's been this ongoing balance. I've really never to this day truly made the decision on going academic or going applied. I'm still, I think, living both. And so I think that's a nice overview for my own career. I'm going to share my document here in a moment with you. Let me just get set up on this, and we can jump into the Hogan in a little bit on the psychometrics of that.
How did you find the Hogan and decide that it was something you wanted to spend the time on? Why is the Hogan worth the time for you?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. Some of that may come up on a later slide, but the Hogan was introduced to me when I was pursuing my master's thesis, and it was a much different inventory back then. This would have been in about 2000, right at the turn of the century. So about 20 years ago, Hogan was in a very, very different place with what they were using. And it was available to me as a graduate student at, I can't remember if it was a discounted rate or a research for free rate. I believe it was a discounted rate. And then there was funding for using the Hogan at that time. So that was when I first used it. Then it came back around about maybe 7, 8 years later, 6 years later, at Blue Cross Blue Shield. We started using it with leaders in the organization, particularly in the operations area. And we were doing it mostly around coaching and development. So that gave me another exposure to the Hogan. And as I've pursued my own consulting firm, it was by choice that I chose the Hogan. And people have different loyalties to different personality assessments. An old friend of mine had recommended become assessment agnostic, and I understand what he's saying with that. I agree mostly, not completely. I think there's real value to becoming expert on one particular assessment and being able to do a lot with it. Now, part of that becomes, what's that assessment about, which we'll get to as well as we go forward. But yeah, the Hogan was one of the first personality assessments introduced to me. As another little tidbit, I never had a course on personality. At the time, my university didn't have somebody to teach that particular course. So most of what I knew from personality was learned through the master's thesis, through my own reading, and then through applied situations later on. So it's been a buildup of that over time. And then ultimately through Hogan certification. That was how I found out more about the Hogan in particular. But as Bob Hogan is around SIOP a lot, so the association that a lot of industrial organizational psychologists are a part of. So you hear a lot about the Hogan going forward, and it's very well respected in the IO field as a personality assessment, and some of that'll come up in just a minute as well. So other questions before we shift gears a little bit?
That's great, thanks.
Great. Okay, so I'm going to try to make sure I've got to the side here another screen for myself to keep an eye on things. And as I was saying before, I'm looking forward to learning from you today as well. I'm looking forward to some of the breakout rooms and some of the discussion that we'll have in probably about 10 to 15 minutes here. And my hope is, I don't want to cover I don't want to boil the ocean here. I'm hoping to leave you with a couple key, stay with you forever takeaways around personality assessment and the underlying psychometrics. We're not going to go real deep into actual statistics or anything like that, but give you some things to think about as you're thinking about personality assessment. And I'm guessing that most of you probably believe in the power of personality assessments. Even if you don't, you've probably at least taken a personality assessment, or you may be aware of the somewhat current debate. It's about a few years old now on whether or not personality assessments are even worth it. But I'm not sure how many of you have ever actually thought about writing a personality assessment and how that takes place. And if you were to do it, how would you go about writing one? So think about that a little bit. How would you go about that? Would you actually be able to list out the steps that you would need to take to develop an assessment? And the associated question with that, would it be worth it for you to do so in the end? So that's a couple things to think about. As you're thinking about that, here's some information about why we even care about personality. Now, those from cohort 1 with a really, really good memory may recognize the slide that I've got in front of you right now. And by the way, we measure good memory on Hogan, so we could look back and make predictions about who would actually remember that. But we've talked about the team strengths aspect in the DODC with some really cool results that are suggesting that across the two cohorts, that the DODC culture is driven by the values of altruistic and aesthetics, and that the DODC culture is a little bit more indifferent towards that value of affiliation. In broader terms, as a group, we want to help the world And we're looking to do it in these new and creative ways, really think outside the box a bit. But we're okay not working as a group to accomplish those items too, or we're indifferent towards not accomplishing those items as a group. So for those of you who have completed individual coaching sessions with me, we've also discussed what underlies your behaviors and interactions, as well as how you approach change and conflict. These personality questions, they've been formal questions of interest in the psychology of work for more than 100 years now, dating back to really the end of World War I from a formal standpoint. Mike Zicker, who I know Steve has mentioned before, and who's a professor of industrial and organizational psychology at BG, also a highly respected name in the field, he co-authored an article about 10 years ago on the early days of personality testing in industry. And apparently back then, a lot of the focus was on maladjustment. So what are these workers who aren't fitting in? What's happening there? And how do we get this cleaned up so that the workplace is operating more effectively? And the questions on these assessments back then, still fun ones. So do you ever get angry when you see red, or so angry that you see red? And do you like to go on blind dates? Those types of questions were still on assessments going back 100 years or 70 years. But despite all this interest in personality testing and the workplace, the field nearly died out in the early 1970s. So thinking about that, here's the stuff they're using for prediction, particularly around maladjustment. How could that possibly die out or really drop down low in the early 1970s? What's going on there that could make that happen? So the answer, or part of the answer, is in the late 1960s, you got to remember behaviorism was still strong. And this concept that the situation defines action, defines our behaviors, that was the lead in thinking at the time. That was leading the thinking at the time. So Walter Mischel, who some of you may know because of the experiment that he ran involving small children and encouraging them not to eat marshmallows on self-control, he wrote a book in 1968 that reviewed personality psychology, and he challenged the validity of personality assessment, pointing out that personality up to that time, in those first, that's 50 or so years, really hadn't explained very much of behavior. And personality psychology became this really intense debate back then. As an example, I mentioned my master's thesis earlier. There were sports psychologists who were also involved in this debate in their own conferences, and there's a lot going on there in the 60s and 70s. I believe it was John Kane and Brent Rushall. Brent Rushall, actually, I moderated a panel with him at SIOP about 20 years ago, interestingly enough. So Kane at this conference presents data that suggests 20% of participation in sport is explainable by personality. Same conference, Rushall presents on how personality makes no difference whatsoever in sports performance. Now, participation and performance are different constructs. So yeah, you could debate that, well, they're not in conflict with each other, but basically it's an example of where you have the credulous camp and the skeptical camp of the time. And the animosity is so great in this case that Kane's presenting at that conference, and he apparently goes over his time limit. And another sports psychologist starts flipping the lights on and off, trying to get him to stop. Your time's up, you're done. Kane keeps going, he falls off the stage. And then he actually gets back up and gets onto the stage again and starts back up again. He's like, for my second act, and he keeps going. So there were some harsh feelings going on during that time around personality and whether it made a difference or not. So all of this is to say that measuring this concept of personality, and mostly it was being done through identity as the approximant, as the proxy for personality, it wasn't producing the consistent results that we typically are looking for in academic research and in application. And this idea of internal traits was really stuck. It wasn't, that's where the science was at. And now you have Mischel pushing back on that, and you weren't getting a lot of movement there. So thinking back now to the personality assessment that I asked you to build at the beginning of this presentation, what would you do differently how would you come back from what was going on in the early 1970s? I want you to think about that a little bit. How would you re-energize the field of personality psychology, which is on its dying breaths? If you were working in the early 1970s on this, what might you do differently than this issue of identity and this actor's view that is up on the slide right now? And I'm going to give you the answer here in a second of how they sort of approached it. A couple things that moved things forward in the later 1970s and onward. So a few things happened that turned it around. First of all, the 5-factor model of personality emerges from an entire line of empirical research. I'm guessing most of you know about the 5-factor model. This is the one where OCEAN is an acronym for it: openness to experience, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism, which is also sometimes called emotional stability. So what's useful about the 5-factor model is that it provides a system for classifying individual differences. It took all these personality pieces from the past, went through, I don't want to use the word merge, but I'm going to end up using it here, sort of merges them together, looks at it through this statistical method, and comes up with the 5 different factors that are common, most common in defining personality. But there's some limits to it. Still didn't get us far enough away from the issue on that previous slide about identity and this issue of traits. That's something internal to me. It doesn't move us far enough away from that. The California Psychological Inventory comes along, the CPI, and instead of traits, it's looking at social outcomes. So in my interactions with others, and how do I understand myself better? It's not just who am I as I think about it from the inside. It's how am I perceiving myself based on these social outcomes that I'm trying to achieve here. And then the Hogans, who were hosting or leading a graduate seminar in personality, similar to the type of seminar that you're in through the DODC program. The Hogans, they're leading this seminar on personality for graduate students in 1987. They're teaching it. They take it one step further, and they bring together identity and reputation. And they do this through something called socioanalytic theory. One of the important, it's getting at the social outcomes piece. One important claim of socioanalytic theory is this idea that reputation, measures of reputation, that's actually an important distinction there, measures of reputation should predict performance better than self-report measures of personality. And reputation in this case is your perceptual identity that you form based on the collective perceptions of others. So now instead of just thinking about who do I think I am and possibly being pretty inaccurate about that, based on what others, how they react to me and how those social interactions go, I form this social identity that really guides this next wave in personality, particularly with Hogan. That's really what it's guiding there. But we've got the 5-factor model, and you've got this different outlook of social outcomes going along. And along with those changes and years of scale validation, which seems like a clause to throw into the sense I don't want it to get overlooked, but years of scale validation, the Hogan Personality Inventory emerges. And it becomes this bastion of accurate prediction of workplace social outcomes, of personality, of who we are personality-wise in the workplace. And so it's a huge, huge step forward, and personality science has continued to go forward really since that point. It's been a big stepping stone. So what are the implications here? First and foremost, the Hogan assessment that we gave you is backed by, and I'm going to use a scientific word I think here, tons of research and theory. You've got to have both. You've got to have the theory, you got to have the empiricism there for an assessment to really, really be effective. And the Hogan was developed specifically for measuring and predicting personality within those social outcomes in the workplace. One of the intents, one of the uses, the reason I use Hogan is to provide a vast amount of rich and really contextual information for coaching and development. Some of you have heard me as we've gone through the coaching sessions try to recall, and I actually counted before this session, so that now this is why I know it off the top of my head. We've got 28 high-level Hogan scales. That's a lot on a personality inventory. But we also have 124 subscales. We're talking about a lot of scales there. So if you think about that, that's a lot to work from when you're working with someone to coach and develop, particularly around leaders. It works across all people, but a lot of the focus here is on coaching leaders. So second, what I'm going to tell you is you'll probably see an assortment of personality assessments as you go forth in the program and beyond. So organizational development, organizational change, you're going to see a lot of assessments. And I think one of the key tips I can offer on this is you always want to be thinking about what criteria was this assessment designed to measure. So it's not necessarily that there's a good assessment or a bad assessment. As thought leaders, what's really important there is to discover what the assessment is designed to measure, and then to really ask yourself, does that criteria match up to your needs? Why are you doing this? What are you hoping to accomplish through it? Does the criteria that this assessment is designed to measure, does that meet your needs? Another thing you want to be asking there is this assessment validated? And bringing that sort of back around and together, predictive validity is a phrase that we often will use. And what predictive validity is really getting at is how well an assessment measures or estimates a criterion. There was another BG, industrial organizational psychologist, very, very famous one, good guy, Bob Guyan. He's passed away since, but in 1960s, he was really big on this issue of criteria and criterion development. So Bowling Green is blessed with really strong industrial organizational and psychology history. I want to come back to that issue of validation because I sort of went off track for a second there. The answer to, is it validated? Like if you ask someone, hey, is it a valid inventory? The answer isn't always simple. So entire technical manuals are built around assessments. You probably should be looking that over as you're considering using an assessment. And particularly if you're doing it for a client or for somebody you work for, you want to make sure that the statistical piece is there and you want to find out what it's based on theoretically. But you also want to know more specifically what contexts is the assessment validated for. So, and people, if you ask that question off the top of their head, a lot of folks won't necessarily know the answer. They're going to refer you to a technical manual, but you want to be asking those questions. Make sure you're using the right tool for the right task is another way to put that. In terms of Hogan, one of the most robust assessments, and this goes back to Steve's question of why do I use Hogan? Why do I prefer to use Hogan? And by the way, I do use other assessments for other purposes, but for coaching and development, trying to think if there's any time I don't use anything, if I use something other than Hogan. I think I'm pretty exclusive to Hogan. I don't get, a cut of the cost from Hogan or anything like that. It's just a really, really powerful inventory. And when it comes to validation about predicting personality at work, I personally believe it's one of the best, if not the best one out there. So that's the formal part of the presentation. What I think we want to do next here, and there'll be a chance to come back and ask questions at the end. We'll go into the breakout groups. I don't want to sidetrack again there. So what we're going to do next is split you into subgroups, breakout groups. And on the slide in front of you are some sentence stems to get you started. When you get into the groups, take a minute or so to just jot down some notes before you really hold yourself to that minute as a group to jot notes about 2 of the 4 sentence stems. You can break my rules, by the way. These are general guidelines. Pick out 2 of the 4 sentence stems and then put down your completion of those sentences. Then start to go around, take turns completing those sentence stems and share those with each other. It's also okay if multiple people use the same sentence stem as a starter. And if you want, you can even create your own sentence stem. Again, I break my rules, break the guidelines there. Steve, I believe we're going 10 minutes in groups. And then when you're done in the groups, we'll come back together for a full group Q&A.
Yeah.
Sound good?
Sounds good. And I encourage you all to undo your videos if you have them muted, so to speak, or off. Get engaged, jump in. follow the self-reflection questions, and we'll see you back here in 10 minutes. You'll see a screen pop up that says join a breakout room. So you can click on it, join, and go on and have your conversation now.
I may pop